Oklahoma's News 4, in collaboration with United Voice Oklahoma. This is a special presentation, an honest discussion on race in our state and nation, moderated by Kevin Ogle and Jolene Chaney, with Oklahoma City Mayor David Holt. From United Voice, Pastor Clarence Hill, Minister and Social Advocate CeCe Jones Davis, and from the nation's capital, Senator James Langford.
Hi, everyone. We want to welcome you to a United Voice Town Hall. I'm Kevin Ogle, joined tonight by Jolene Chaney.
We are welcoming a panel of local leaders for an in-depth conversation about race relations here in Oklahoma. A conversation long overdue, but pushed to the forefront right now by the death of George Floyd in Minneapolis.
And unless you haven't been watching TV or have no social media, you know Mr. Floyd was a 46-year-old black man accused of buying cigarettes with a counterfeit $20 bill. He died in police custody, and the video showing a white police officer pressing his knee into Floyd's neck has caused national and worldwide outrage. The protests that followed across the country and here in Oklahoma have been at times peaceful and then at times like this, violent, but made up of a multi-ethnic group of people who say they're just standing together against injustice. Black Americans saying their voices must be heard because this issue is tearing our country apart. And tonight, we hope to help open up those lines of communication.
We want to begin with Pastor Clarence Hill. He leads a church in Norman. And Pastor, we talked with you last weekend, and at that time, you told us George Floyd's death is a tipping point for all of us. Let's start there. As someone who has been a social advocate for years, you know America's seen other similar videos like this, but why is this case the tipping point?
You know, it takes me back to 2016 and the deaths of Alton Sterling and Philando Castile, and then the deaths of the 5 police officers. Even in that situation, you saw a split in America where you had one part of America mourning over the 2 unarmed black men, and you had another part of America mourning the 5 police officers. This situation is different because what I've seen is that not only is Black America seeking to have greater voice and to be heard, but this time we see this great awakening of empathy where you have white America saying, we actually feel it with you this time. My own phone has been filled with text messages of people reaching out just to say, I don't know all what to say right now, but I care. And we, in all of my 47 years, have never been through a time like that before.
Pastor, thank you. Oklahomans have been protesting for several days in the wake of George Floyd's death. Mayor Holt, you took part in the peaceful protest on Sunday afternoon. You know how powerful it was for everyone to come together, and some described it even as beautiful. Then a large group broke off, marched to the Capitol, and there were some in that group who vandalized the Capitol building with graffiti. Then later that night, we saw clashes in downtown Oklahoma City with quite a bit of violence and property damage.
It went from one extreme in the afternoon to another by nightfall, and we know that those who engage in peaceful protest are looking for really a voice, not violence. Doesn't the message, though, get completely lost once the protests turn violent?
Well, first of all, yes, Sunday's event, the one over in Northeast Oklahoma City near 36th and Kelly, was very powerful, very impactful, and I did attend that and listen. And it was well organized, and it was organized by Black Lives Matter and the NAACP and people in our community who've been working these issues for a very long time and also know how to plan an event and know how to coordinate it. And then there was sort of a spontaneous walk to the Capitol. And since you mentioned it, I want to point out that yes, there was a young white male in his 20s who did spray paint the recently restored doors of the Capitol, but almost immediately, all of the people standing up there began using their own clothing or their own materials to try and clean that paint off, and they shooed him away. And to me, that was what it was really about. I mean, I thought actually kind of a beautiful moment came out of that act of vandalism. And then another group marched down to police headquarters in the county jail. And, you know, throughout the daytime, that in itself was also had some very beautiful moments. As you saw, a lot of engagement between police officers there and with the protesters. And that's what we need to have. And so those conversations were happening, and that was impactful. Every time we've had issues, and it's only been early on Saturday and Sunday night, that's happened late at night. And it's not the same people during the day. It's really not. And I saw that with my own eyes on Wednesday night. And so, we will continue to protect our city, but we will also continue to protect the rights of Black Lives Matter and the NAACP and all the just average citizens out there who want to have their voice heard. And that's what I think we need to focus on more than anything, and not let the broken windows drown out the important voices that we're hearing. And sure, it can be a distraction, but I'm trying really hard to not let it be.
And Mayor Black Lives Matter OKC issued a list of demands for city leaders, even Governor Stitt on Monday. Let's listen to some of that news conference and their demands.
We demand an apology from Police Chief Wade Gurley and Mayor David Holt, and ask for the immediate resignation of Chief Gurley, whose lack of leadership resulted in aggressive actions by the police toward peaceful protesters, escalating tensions and resulting in violence that could have been and should have been avoided.
Mayor, you met with the organization this week. Couple of questions. What was achieved in that meeting? And then on Tuesday night, you were out there with the protesters talking one-on-one with them until midnight. What kind of achievement did you get on both those situations?
Yeah, and I think a minute ago I referred to that as Wednesday night. You'll forgive me if the days start to run together at this point, but yes, Tuesday night is when I was out there. But earlier in the day, that was quite a day. We had a 6-hour discussion at council meeting about police policies. We had several hours of that were citizens who called in, and literally anyone who called in was able to speak directly to the mayor, the council, the city manager, and the police chief, which I think is a wonderful attribute of local government, that you really get to have your voice heard. And then I spent 2 hours with Black Lives Matter. So this was the day after that press conference that you just played a clip from. And they really focused in on a couple of policy issues, and that's what I emerged from that meeting talking about. And I think we have common ground there, that we want to revisit our city's de-escalation policy, and we'd like to revisit the Citizens Advisory Board. So that is a longstanding but little known group related to our police department that was created with all the best intentions a long time ago. It just doesn't possibly have all of the accountability and tie back to the community and credibility with the community that it really needs. Very few people know much about it. I'm the mayor, and I honestly don't know a lot about it. It doesn't meet publicly. It's not posted. And so that's something we want to look at. It's a more credible accountability mechanism for police, and also a new de-escalation policy. And after that, as you said, I went down to the police headquarters and the county jail around 9:15 and spent several hours just listening. And it's raw and it's uncomfortable and it's a lot of pain, but that's what people like me need to hear. So I wanted to have that experience.
Well, we went live at 11 and he was still out there talking to the folks. Black Lives Matter OKC issued demands for the police chief and also Governor Stitt. Now, we want to mention we invited both Chief Wade Gurley and also Governor Stitt to join us tonight. They were unable to because of scheduling issues.
CeCe Jones Davis, you're a minister and a social advocate, and you have really been focusing on the justice system and some high-profile cases here in Oklahoma. And you talk about systematic bias. Many believe the justice system is absolutely stacked against African Americans, and this is a conversation where we've all come to learn. So tell us your experience and what are you seeing here in Oklahoma?
Absolutely, and thank you so much for having me join this illustrious panel. I really appreciate it. I am focused on one particular case in the criminal justice system here in Oklahoma, and that is with Julius Jones. And many people out there, when I say his name, know who I'm speaking of. And I watched a docuseries about his case on ABC a couple of years ago, and ever since I've been just very disturbed and hoping to add voice and advocacy to making sure that Oklahoma does not execute a potentially wrongfully convicted person. I think that we might stand at risk of that. But what I've learned so much about criminal justice as a result. I've learned so much about the state of Oklahoma. And I think it's really important to first say that our state has recently done an extraordinary thing in, I believe, commuting almost 500 cases in our system. And that, of course, is thanks to Governor Stitt. And, there's so many people in Oklahoma working on things like criminal justice reform. And I think that it's really important that when we do make these kinds of efforts, that we do consider very well the issues of race. I believe, and a juror believed, and other people believe that race played a part in Julius Jones, for example, being on death row. We know from a study done by Northwestern University on the state of Oklahoma that an African-American man is 3 times more likely to receive a death sentence than a white person who commits a similar crime. And so there are many racial disparities. And I am hoping that this conversation that we're having nationally, the conversation we're having on a state level, will open our eyes to the stories that are kind of pouring out in the last few years about wrongful convictions and how race has played in those things.
Thank you. Senator Langford, I know you feel passionate about this. You and I have talked about it before. Next year marks the 100-year anniversary of the Tulsa race massacre. For decades, the media in Oklahoma ignored what happened, so we're going to clearly state it here tonight. The Greenwood district in Tulsa, also dubbed Black Wall Street, was looted and burned by a white mob. 35 square blocks, torched 1,200 homes. Hundreds were killed.
It is a disgraceful chapter of our state's history, and for the most part, Oklahoma children have never heard about it. We didn't teach it in our classrooms, we didn't discuss it. Only recently has this event been introduced into the school curriculum. Senator, you grew up here. Why do we have really such a hard time talking about our past?
Yeah, we have a hard time talking about our past because we talk about the good, the bad, and the ugly. That is the ugly. That moment in Oklahoma history that is, quite frankly, a part of American history. 99 years ago, this past weekend, that's the part that's so chilling of it. 99 years ago, this past weekend, a white mob went into an African-American wealthy community and burned it to the ground, and hundreds were killed at that point. And then, quite frankly, the insurance companies that were there walked away from it and said it was a riot, and so we don't cover that. And it left those folks out there literally with nothing. There were a few churches, there were the Red Cross, there were other folks that stepped in to be able to walk alongside that community, but has left it devastated for a century now. And it's one of the things that we didn't talk about as Oklahomans, but we absolutely should talk about as Oklahomans. My team several years ago went back and asked the question, in Oklahoma law right now already, it is by law, it has to be taught in our schools, but there was no curriculum to actually teach it. It's one of those moments to say, yes, you should do it, but we're not going to help you do it. And so we pulled together a team to actually get a curriculum with video, with images, so teachers could use it on their smart board if they want to do it for, a whole week, or if they want to do it for a day or for a class period. At least it could be taught, not just should be, but could be taught, and to be able to put that out there, because we as a state should talk about some of those moments. Because when you talk to some African-American families, there's still the residual of that left over. And so you don't just say, well, gosh, that was 100 years ago. That has nothing to do with now. There are generational issues that I think some people just want to ignore and pretend aren't really there, but are there, both in the white community and in the Black community. And that's why I push so hard to say, let's pull this out of the darkness and let's look at this in the light. And let's try to be able to talk about what really happened to gain greater understanding.
Thank you, Senator. We do want to take a break now.
When we come back, more on Oklahoma's dark history and what can be done to make up for the past. Welcome back to a United Voice Town Hall, an open, honest discussion about race relations in Oklahoma amid the ongoing protest here at home and around the world. We want to thank our local community leaders for joining us today. There they are, 2 members of the United Voice Initiative, Pastor Clarence Hill and social advocate Cece Jones Davis, along with Oklahoma City Mayor David Holt, and from D.C., U.S. Senator James Langford. Let's hear now from Mayor Holt. These days we hear a lot about economic inequality. It's a fancy term that boils down to very real differences between some Oklahoma families. Earlier this week, we heard you talking about growing up here in Oklahoma City and how children born and raised in one part of the city don't get the same opportunities as kids who are born and raised in other parts of the city.
So Mayor Holt, what can you do to make sure that all Oklahoma City children have the same opportunity to succeed?
Well, first we have to help everybody in our city, especially in the white community, understand and really internalize what you just referenced that I was talking about earlier this week. And maybe I'll kind of lay it out again. You know, it can be intoxicating to credit ourselves for past success. And obviously this city is a more just place than it was in 1958. And, you know, repeal of Jim Crow laws and the fact that overt acts of racism are usually shouted down in the public square gives us some sort of comfort sometimes. But it releases us as white people from our obligation to accept that actual outcomes have not realized the potential that was dreamed of in the 1960s when people locked arms and marched down our streets. And what I'm talking about is the reality that I know that because I grew up in Northwest 122nd and Rockwell as a white guy in Northwest OKC, that I have a higher life expectancy, a greater chance of economic success, a greater chance of higher educational achievement, just because of having grown up there than somebody who grows up at Northeast 23rd and MLK. And that continuous, that very consistent outcome difference between where you grew up or what color your skin is illustrates that there really isn't equal opportunity. And it's fashionable sometimes to say that in America we all have equal opportunity because some maybe have overcome the challenges that were put in front of them. But if statistically most find those challenges too much to bear, I think we have to accept that the opportunity is not truly equal. And so accepting that is the first step, because then you have the critical mass of people in your city who are willing to make change. And then that change comes through any number of things, making sure that, you know, government expenditures bring equity. You know, MAPS 4, I feel, was a good illustration of that, with $100 million of it going directly in Northeast Oklahoma City, including the Clara Luper Civil Rights Center. That was an exhibition of an attempt to try to have more equitable spending across the city. Government representation is another aspect of that. You know, the voters hold some of that power, but, you know, as a mayor, I appoint hundreds of people to boards and commissions. And when I took office, 90% of those volunteer boards were white people, largely from Northwest Oklahoma City and largely men. And we're trying to change that. But, you know, we have to make sure that the educational system is providing equal opportunity. We have to make sure that, you know, our job training, you go on down the road. It took us decades to get into this situation. It's going to take more than a week to get us out of it, but it starts with people's hearts. And that's what's happening this week. And then we've got to continue to just push that conversation forward and not let it go after the rallies stop, you know, because this is going to be a long haul of many months and years to reach a more just society. But I've never been more heartened that the rising generations in Oklahoma City, especially in the white community, realize that and have that as a goal now more than ever before.
Thank you, Mayor. Cece, we would like to go back to you and stick with this topic of different opportunities for different kids. I know you speak about the right to educational equity for all children. Talk about the long-term implications of what the inequity in our school system is doing to some of our kids, and we know that's a very real challenge here in Oklahoma.
Yeah, for sure. And, you know, we have experts here in Oklahoma who know so much more about educational inequity than I do. We have Lee Rowland, we have Angela Little. But what I do know is that, and what we all know is that, you know, Oklahoma has been struggling for some time when it comes to, you know, educational disparities on a national level. And we know that, you know, equity for us would look like having experienced teachers and educators and administrators in all schools where, you know, teachers don't just kind of cut their teeth in one kind of school and then once they've got experience move on to quote unquote better schools. So we know, you know, that equity will look like having those same level of teachers in all schools. We know that equity will look like facilities and equipment and technology and services kind of being available for all schools, no matter what district you're in, no matter what zone you're in, no matter how much your house costs. compared to someone else's house in another neighborhood. So we know those are things that would help us to give minority kids, African American, Hispanic, Native kids in Oklahoma, a lot more opportunity. We know that currently, I believe a study came out in mid-March that says something like 167,000 kids in Oklahoma public schools don't have access to the internet. And so these are like the real practical things that we need in order for all kids to get the benefit of a good education in Oklahoma.
Thank you so much. And Pastor Hill, Oklahoma's history includes some really dark moments. And earlier we talked about the Tulsa race massacre, but we also have a documented history of many Oklahoma communities being sundown towns where there were laws that stated African Americans had to be off the streets or out of town by sundown. We know Edmond and Norman were both sundown towns, and the city of Norman recently issued an apology officially condemning its own history.
But there were more than 50 sundown towns in Oklahoma. Pastor, do you think it would be important for other communities to issue similar apologies?
I think this is a great time to lean in to change. When I grew up in Iowa, and we were so conditioned, just like a lot of Black men are conditioning our own sons to know how to respond to police. I was conditioned to be super careful and a little bit nervous whenever we drove through small towns. I could always remember hearing my mother get a little nervous talking to my father about the speed limit as he drove. And I think this is an opportunity where there seems to be this awakening moment, this empathy moment, for us not to be careful about how we make change this time. In my experience, and what we've been doing through the years, seeking to work really hard outside of tragedies, what I've seen is that when a racial incident happens, and when it becomes obvious that it's race, a lot of times you'll have a parent, African-American parent at a school or in an organization that wants to see change, but the leadership is embarrassed, and a lot of times they're seeking to protect their reputation more than they are caring for the people that they're serving. And I think this is an opportunity to flip the script and to say to anyone, hey, you don't have to make an announcement, but this is not a have to moment. This is a moment to say, who are we as Oklahomans? And the last I saw, we're a people of resilience, and we have an Oklahoma standard. Now let's pour that into this topic and take advantage of this moment.
Thank you, Pastor. Senator Langford, we know language is important. The way you speak to someone says so much about what you think about them. So there's a lot of pain and a lot of anger when President Trump says things like, there were very fine people among the white supremacists too in Charlottesville, but referring to Black football players who took a knee in a protest as SOBs and other comments. Can you talk about the role of our elected leaders, especially in difficult times like these, when facing the national effects of long-term racism, where generations feel the pain of injustice and inequality? Whether it's President Trump or whoever, shouldn't our elected leaders be speaking words that bring healing?
Yeah, water is so much better than gasoline to be able to pour on a fire. And that's a key, just basic truth that we can have in a conversation like this. When things get heated and people get frustrated and say, I've been trying to say something to you for a long time and you haven't been listening, at that point, one of the best things we can say is not to say anything at all. It's to listen. And that's one of the grand challenges that we have in leadership, is having enough people that can stop and hear, and enough people that have the opportunity to be heard. Now, our words are important. I think you should be careful in your words and how you actually articulate things to someone else, so you're not saying something to someone that they hear one way and you mean it entirely different. And that can happen in a lot of flippant conversations, just to be able to say something. There's been some statements about President Trump and statements that he's made about the rioters that immediately it said, well, you're attributing that to the protesters as well. I don't think he is. I think he does have the differences, but the words do matter at this point. And it's important for us to be able to engage in a way, not just to speak careful words to be able to engage, but to also listen closely. And one of the things that I would really tell you is really important, and is one of these things about race that I think is a vital thing, is if you don't have somebody in your life of a different ethnicity that you can have a real conversation with, let your guard down and say, I don't understand this, or help me with this, or someone that loves you and knows you enough that can say, hey, when you said that, that was dumb. If you don't have someone in your life like that, why don't you? Because that would mean your friendships among ethnicities are so shallow that you have no one that you trust enough that can push back against you and to be able to help you understand culture in a way that you have missed in the past. And so it's one of the things that I really challenge people on is not just their words and their listening, but making sure you've got somebody that you know and you love, and they know and love you, and they know your heart enough that you can have those kind of difficult conversations and to fix each other's language.
And staying with you, Senator Langford, for years you have talked about a concept called Solution Sunday, and I know you're really passionate about it. You literally took to the floor of the Senate to tell other lawmakers about it. So tell us how engaging in Solution Sunday could make Oklahoma a better place.
It could definitely make things a better place, and it's fun. My friend Clarence is on this meeting as well because he's also been engaged in this as years as well. And in fact, we met each other because we were both working on the same thing and didn't even know that we were working on the same thing. And that's how we first met years ago. The idea is very simple, and it started with a conversation in 2016 after there was the killing again of an African-American man. And then there was a shooting of 5 police officers in Dallas just weeks later. And in that dialogue, in that conversation, that race conversation, I started walking around to people that I knew in Oklahoma, and sometimes just total strangers even, of all races, and asked a simple question. Has your family ever invited a family of a different race, a different ethnicity, into your home for dinner? And what I got most of the time from all races I talked to, most of the people I talked to answered that question the same way. They said, I have friends of another race. And I would smile at them and say, that's not what I asked you. I asked, do you have your family ever invited a family of another race into your home and you've had dinner? Because it's different to say you talk about race than if your kids see the normalcy of conversation. And the way I try to say it to people all the time is we'll never get all the issues on the table till we get our feet under the same table and we just have normal conversations. Now, when I spark this to people and I push on them, many people will say, I don't know who I would ask. And that's my first clue to say, okay, you have a problem. You have friendly conversations with people of another race. You don't have friends of another race. If it's an awkward conversation for you to invite someone over, you should be able to invite someone over to your home for a meal just to be able to sit and visit. The second thing that comes up is people will say, well, I don't know what we would talk about. Again, I smile at them and say, okay, again, this is exposing what the problem is. We're Oklahomans. We're going to talk about weather and football. That's what we're going to talk about when we sit around the table. We're just going to have normal conversations. You don't have to have a big formal presentation with a list of questions. All I'm asking is, would you break past the threshold of your own home and a history in your own family, and to be able to just sit down and to be able to have a meal and start developing a friendship? Because I'm convinced race is not an issue that we can vote on and fix in Congress. Race is an issue that has to be fixed in every individual family when that family has that conversation, not a national conversation among political leaders, a national conversation of each family having conversation about race and inviting other families to come walk with them.
Thank you, Senator. We do want to take another break now.
But when we come back, a radical idea launched right here at home. This has never been done anywhere else in the country, but it is working here. That's next.
Welcome back to a United Voice Town Hall and an open, honest discussion about race relations in Oklahoma amid the ongoing protest here at home as well as around the world. We do want to thank our local community leaders for joining us today. 2 members of the United Voice Initiative, Pastor Clarence Hill and social advocate CeCe Jones Davis, along with Oklahoma City Mayor David Holt and U.S. Senator James Langford.
You know, a couple of years ago, Pastor Hill and several other gentlemen had an idea, and it was a radical idea. It had never been done before in any other city in the United States. They took that idea to just about every media outlet in the state, and it led to something revolutionary. Clarence, why don't you talk a little bit about the United Voice Project? You and CeCe are both a part of it. What makes this particular project so unusual?
Well, I know that we all probably have felt the division in our land, but it's the conversation, it was the unfriending that was going on through social media and amongst neighbors. And so it was like no one really had a context to be able to discuss the topic of race or justice or these things that people actually cared about. So we hosted our bridge conference with the Stronger Together movement. We put people at tables together, and we do what Senator Langford was talking about. We sit people at tables of different ethnic groups, different wealth classes, and give people the opportunity to hear the stories of those that they would normally not hear. And so out of that conference, one of the former GMs of Fox decided, hey, let me go around to all of the general GMs of the local stations, and they need to hear this story of how the race conversation is being handled. And people were actually getting up from the table, smiling, making connection, and having new friends. How can you talk about race and be friends later? So the media, the Oklahoman, several radio stations, Perry Broadcasting included, Tyler Media, all jumped in and said, hey, we agree with this one vision to shift and promote a healthy dialogue on race. And ever since, for the last 2 or 3 years, we've been putting out stories so that the population doesn't just see Blacks and minorities in situations of tension or getting arrested or areas of frustration, but of stories of contribution so that people can see what a lot of us already know, that the minority communities contribute a lot to our state, and all of the channels jumped in on it, and we have made a lot of progress and helped shift the narrative throughout the last few years.
Thank you, Pastor. And Cece, tell us about your involvement in the United Voice Initiative.
Yeah, so I was really fortunate that Clarence asked me to be a part of it, and I co-host the United Voice podcast with Lieutenant Waylon Cubitt, and we just have a really remarkable time where we focus specifically on talking about race in Oklahoma through people's stories. And we wanted to really create an environment and a platform where we could have civil discourse, civil conversation with lives and their ideas and how things have brought us together, how things have divided us. And so it's been honestly a really therapeutic platform. It's been really healing. It's been extremely educational. And I feel like, I know I've benefited from just sitting in there asking people questions and talking to people. But I feel like so many people throughout Oklahoma have tapped in podcasts and have really they feel like I do. It's just been a really healing opportunity to be able to talk about these kinds of things in a non-threatening environment.
Thank you. Senator Langford and Mayor Holt, James and David, you're both fathers. You're both raising your kids in a state that still experiences some significant challenges economically, educationally, and from this discussion, we can see that we still have a lot to figure out when it comes to racial issues. What can you tell other parents about the discussions we all need to be having with our kids? We're both parents, so history doesn't continue to repeat itself. Senator Langford, we will start with you.
Yeah, let me go back to my previous conversation about families. Race is not something that you can just vote out. Race really gets passed on through a family. And I think a lot of our families don't want to admit that. But when your kids grow up, maybe not hearing negative words or racial terms, but they never see their parents interact with someone of another race, then they just kind of get a quiet message. If there's never anyone of a different ethnicity that's ever in your home or in your circle of friends or in places that you go and interact, there's just a quiet message that gets passed on to your kids. And so one of the best things that you can do for your children in the issue of race is just have friends and friendships as adults and draw those families in to be able to interact with your family. We are all sharing the same playgrounds and interacting and talking and live nearby each other. Why don't we become friends and have real friendships from there as well? And so the key is the words you use. It's what you're watching on TV and the dialogue that you have while you're watching on TV. If you see a show that shows racism, to be able to speak about it. If you see something on the news, that your kids hear your opinion about the issue of race as things are coming up on the news, that they're not just trying to be able to pick it up on their own, but you're actually teaching your kids as you raise them specifically about this issue of understanding culture, of engaging with people that may look different or have a different background, and that you can develop them as friendships and relationships. I'm a Christian, unashamed of that. I see all people as created in the image of God and have value and worth. I want my kids to have that same kind of value, that every person has value and worth and is worthy of engaging with.
Thank you, Senator. Mayor Holt, same question for you.
You know, in Oklahoma City, we do not have legal segregation, but unfortunately, we very much have de facto segregation. And that will be true as long as you can simply say Northeast Oklahoma City, and everybody knows you mean the African-American community of Oklahoma City. And so that creates the danger that our kids can grow up, as Senator Langford just alluded to, without any real exposure to people of different races. And as a dad, I mean, I'm not going to accept that. So our kids are in Oklahoma City public schools, and that provides a great deal of diversity. But if you don't have that opportunity for your kids, you need to find it. And I'll be very candid about that. You cannot let your kids grow up in a homogenous racial environment, because that's not America. They're eventually going to find themselves in a diverse environment, and it needs to not be in their 20s and 30s where they may have already created some sort of stereotypes for lack of having had, an appropriate opportunity to meet other people. And in Oklahoma City, 60% of our kids are non-white. So this is a very diverse community. And so with a statistic like that, you would think that everybody's getting to meet everybody, but that's not necessarily happening. There are definitely pockets of our city where you very much live in your bubble. And we're so large at 620 square miles that we can very, very physically create those bubbles for ourselves. And we have to always work to pierce those bubbles. And then this is just one example. You got to make sure your kids are seeing your community in all of its full beauty.
Thank you, Mayor. And Pastor Hill, I do want to ask the same question to both you and to Cece. What discussion should we be having with our children? Go ahead, Pastor.
Well, I love the old saying that I'm sure anyone could finish, but it's more than what you say. Words can only say so much. Actions speak louder than words. And to live an example to your children will say way more. But I think it's also worth knowing that the future that's in front of us is, like Mayor Holt said, it's changing. And it's to our own advantage to put out a fire before it starts and recognize there's a term called the majority minority. And it's already happened with our children, where minorities are more in number, children of color are more in number than white children. And the estimates say somewhere between 2040 and 2046, that'll be a reality for adults. So I just think it's prudent for us to get ahead of the game and to equip our children to enjoy things, to enjoy other cultures, go to other restaurants. And you will find, just like I found as a dad myself, that my children may be prone to say things about others that look different than them. And that's when I can grab that weed and I can pull it out. And so that my children cannot be doing the same things that their predecessors struggled against for so many years just because of unfamiliarity. I think it's also worth knowing that some of this stuff is not just a black-white issue. It's not just a minority-majority issue. It's a human issue of things that we adapt when we don't have relationship with others. So experience is everything. The people on your walls, the authors of the books that you read, the ones who write poetry, the movies. Think about bringing diversity even in the entertainment area. Take them to a church where they have to figure out how to keep a beat and have a good old conversation on the way home. So it doesn't have to be all out of mourning. It could be joyful too.
Thank you, Pastor. Cece, your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I think that the best way we can equip our children is through history. I think it's really important for kids to, at an age-appropriate level, understand history and have diversity in what they read and how they understand history. Because, when they go to school, those books aren't going to tell them everything. And so I think that, a diverse and comprehensive understanding of of history through many people's lenses, through many people's eyes, would be really, really important. And then I also believe that it's important to understand that our children are resilient. A lot of us feel like we can't have these kinds of conversations because they're too heavy, or, they're too dark, or, whatever it is. But children are resilient. And the sooner we kind of get the right things in kids and help them to kind of learn how to think for themselves, and form their own ideas and own opinions about things as they understand information, I think the better. So we need to, in my opinion, from my experience, African-American children, particularly African-American boys, haven't had the opportunity to not be told certain things by a certain age. And that should not be. All children need information in order to go forward, and create a different narrative and create a different pathway.
Thank you. We'll be right back.
Welcome back to a United Voice Town Hall discussion. I've heard over the past week that a new understanding of America is being born, and birth is painful.
All the moms out there can relate to that. We've all seen significant pain over the past few days. So I'd like to ask all of you, what is the way forward? What can an Oklahoman who's watching us now do in his or her own little corner of the world to make things better? We'd like to hear from each of you. Let's start with Mayor Holt, and you'll each have 1 minute. Mayor.
Well, I would say, to the white community of Oklahoma City, you need to listen. We need to listen. And listen without responding, listen and accept some things that are uncomfortable, and open your heart to that reality. And that's the first step. And then we've got work to do, and it's not going to be done this month. It's just not. And but as you hear people like me and Senator Langford and other leaders maybe talk about new ideas and new approaches that we haven't been talking about before, now where it's coming from, and you need to be ready for it, and you need to accept it and be ready to work with us and support change in every aspect of our lives, so that we can have the more just society that we dreamed of having all the way back 200 years ago, and even in the 1960s. And we'll never reach perfection, but we need to stay on the path. And I think that this week and the days ahead have been an important wake-up call that needed to happen. And I think we're all ready. Thank you. Sorry. Good minute. 1 minute. Okay. Did I?
Well, actually, because of time, we're going to have to change it to 30 seconds, but we appreciate your comment, Mayor. Cece, you're up for your 30 seconds.
Yeah, education. It's important for people to understand that this is not just about George Floyd, that this is about Breonna Taylor, Tatiana Jefferson. This is about Aubrey down in Georgia. This is about so many people. And so people understanding why this is a tipping point, people need to be educated.
Thank you, Cece. Senator Langford.
One of the things I would emphasize is listening, like Mayor Holt was saying, but also get yourself out of your comfort zone. If you've not been in a cultural place in a while that made you uncomfortable and got you to a moment where you realize, I don't know what to do, what to say here, good. Make an intentional decision to be able to develop a friendship with someone who doesn't have the same background as you. We've talked a lot about African-American and white relationships. Now, we've not talked about what we would call Southwest Oklahoma City with Latino relationships here. There are a lot of relationships that need to be built. What may have a language challenge, may have a relational challenge, but you've got to be able to make the intentional decision. I'm going to push myself out of my comfort zone. I'm going to go learn, and I'm not going to expect someone else is going to go solve the race issue when my family has not done our part yet. Your family should step up and do your part as well.
Senator, thank you. Pastor Hill?
Yes, so I was asked several times my opinion about the protests and the damage that was done. And what I said was, this moment is just like taking a 300-pound stone and throwing it down the street. It gets a bunch of attention and people have to react. But I found out that 300 one-pound efforts causes us to have more effect over time. So the commitment that we're calling for is not just to react to this tragedy, but to make a commitment for the long haul. Learn together, step out, do the things that make a difference, and not try to make the Disneyland trip make up for having the hard conversations as family. I believe as Oklahomans, We're called to do this. We can do this. This is who we are, and this is our next level.
Thank you, Pastor. We'll be back with a final word. Before we leave you this evening, we do want to say thank you to our guests who joined us this evening, as well as United Voice member Scotia Moore, who helped with this program. We thank each of you for your time and your input.
You all were terrific, and we knew you would be. We encourage our viewers, you, to take some of the suggestions that you heard tonight, and let's all do our part to improve the conversations that take place in our homes, our schools, our churches, and where we work. We can do better, and we must do better if we want a better future.
Thank you so much for joining us tonight. Have a good night.